Hello and welcome to the Starting a Podcast for Beginners 5-part series. In this part, you'll be launching your podcast, be getting it ready to be distributed to all major podcast platforms, releasing it to the world. Links to all the previous parts will be in the description below. Congratulations on getting to this part. If you're still not sure about when you want to launch your podcast, then just pick a date and get it set in stone now. You're going to want to use some kind of scheduling app or a written diary if you prefer to mark down that date and mark down any other important dates. For example, you might want to release the episode on a certain day, and then a week prior or 2 weeks prior is when you want your trailer to launch. And then maybe a couple of days before release, there might be some other promotional content that you want to schedule to go out. In this video, we're going to go over how to set up a podcast host that you can upload all your content to so that it goes out on that day. You don't have to sign in and post it on the day. You can schedule all of this, and I'm going to go over how to do that in this episode. So let's talk hosting. Your podcast host is going to be a hub where you upload all of your episodes and they're distributed out via RSS feed to all the podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, Samsung, all these places where people can find and listen to podcasts. Examples of some hosts, you may have heard of them, you may have not, but don't worry, we're going to take a look at them and I'll show you which hosts I recommend. Are hosts like Buzzsprout, Captivate, Libsyn, Podbean, Spotify for podcasters, previously known as Anchor. And when you set up one of these systems and upload your podcast episodes, what it does is creates an RSS feed, which is a feed of information that the podcast platforms can read, so that anytime you update that information on your host or add a new episode, the players will get those updates via that RSS feed automatically and publish your new episodes or any changes that you've made. Ideally, you want to set this up a couple of weeks at least before your podcast has launched, because it can take up to a couple of weeks for the podcast players to pick up your RSS feed and for everything to show as it should. There are a couple of free podcast hosts out there, and there are also paid options. I recommend going for a paid option personally, because I don't like the idea of my podcast being the product or me being the product. I want to be the customer. I want access to great customer service. And I feel like the free platforms is more likely to, at any moment, they just decide to take your podcast down, but that's purely anecdotal. And if you don't have the budget for it, then Spotify for Podcasters is free. It lets you put your podcast out there. You can always start with that and then move on to a more feature-rich paid option later on. For this podcast, I'm using a podcast host called Libsyn. It's been around for a very long time, and because I'm only posting fortnightly and they're 30 to 45 minutes, the way that Libsyn charges based on the amount of content you post, it works out really low cost for me. So that's why I've gone with Libsyn, and also because they've been around for a long time, good customer service and things. Captivate is the other podcast host I recommend. Out of all of the podcast hosts that I've used or that I've seen clients used, I find this is the most feature rich. It's got a really nice user interface, and there are no limits to the amount of podcasts you can upload on there. So if you have 2 podcasts, you can use Captivate, your single subscription, to host both of them. So if you want to use one of these, I've left affiliate links in the description below. You don't have to use those links. You can just search for the podcast host or just look for countless other lists online of recommended podcast hosts, and I'm sure you'll find the right one for you. But ultimately, it doesn't make a huge difference. It's not going to affect the growth of your podcast. A podcast host, they all do pretty much the same thing, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. You want to avoid paralysis by analysis, analyzing dozens and dozens of podcast hosts, and just pick one that works. Now you're going to see me set up my podcast on Libsyn. Whichever host you're using, the process is more or less the same. It'll ask you more or less the same questions and the same details. So you can follow along in your podcast host. And if anything's not quite clear, there should be a lot of documentation on any of the hosts that will help you along the way. So I'm on the Libsyn page now with all the plans. As I mentioned, I've got a fortnightly podcast, 45-minute episodes. I'm just starting out with this podcast at launch with the cheaper, the basic option, and it would be a case of clicking getting started. I've got Captivate up there in a tab as well. As you can see, they've got a start your free trial option up there, and it's going to be pretty obvious whichever podcast host you're using. and then there's a sign up page there to get started. Similar sign up page on Libsyn here. So I'm just going to enter my details. And once that's loaded up, you'll be able to enter the name of your podcast, Podcasting Amplified. If you have a promo code, or if you can ask somebody else who uses the platform that you're using, they might have a referral code for you that might get you some discount or a free month. And then add in your details. Obviously, if you're using Spotify for podcasters, you'd be skipping that payment step because it's free. And now we can set up the podcast. So configure your podcast, and you'll be given some kind of option to enter the details for your podcast at this stage. Again, it will look slightly different with your podcast host, but generally they're all going to need the same kind of information, categories, because this is something that's requested by the podcast host, like Apple Podcasts, owner name and email, author, things like that, because these are details that need to be on your RSS feed. So you've probably got stuff, if you've got some kind of planner, if you're using our planner or one of your own, you should be able to just copy and paste a lot of the details in here. So I'm going to find the description that I wrote and just copy and paste that. This is the description that's going to show up on the page for your podcast in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so on. Then for the category, you'll have a bunch of categories. You can either go for a more broad one, like if you have a business podcast, you can just go business. Or if it's more specific and there's an option available, you can use it. But for some podcasts, you're just going to have to use what's there and pick the best option. So my podcast is an interview podcast educating around podcasting. So it could be under education. It could be under business marketing, because people use their podcasts for marketing a lot of the time. I'm going to put in education as the first category and business marketing as the second category. So the owner name is just your name. And if you're not happy with your email showing up to everyone in your RSS feed, then I would use a brand new email that you created. You can always create a free Gmail email address or something, or just whatever public facing email that you're happy to put in there. Now the author is slightly different to the owner name. The owner name will show up in your RSS feed. The author will show up underneath the podcast title. So in Spotify, where it has the name of your podcast, underneath it will have the author name. So that's probably going to be your name, but it could be the name of your business. The website URL is a website link that will show up in your RSS feed. So by default, Libsyn gives you a free generic sort of website. I'm going to enter my own website in here. So if you've got your own website, you can use that. Release frequency, it's going to be every 2 weeks. Not every podcast host will have this option. Third-party content, I'm going to has rights to third-party content because I'm using a song that's technically third-party content in the intro and outro, which I do have a license for. It's an episodic show. It's not serial, meaning that it's not going to be in series. You can listen to any episode in any order that you like. If you have a more story-driven podcast that you have to listen to in order, then serial is probably right for you. In general, the podcast will be clean. I'll be bleeping out any swear words and things just to help with the reach, and it's just not that kind of podcast. Language, English, whatever language your podcast uses. Episode display limit. Again, your podcast host might not have this option available. You can just press 0 and it won't have a limit. I'm going to leave it at 0 for now. I mean, it's going to be a very long time until I reach 300 episodes on this podcast anyway, and we can always change things later on. I'm going to leave feed unlocked for now. Basically, what this means is that it stops you from being able to, stops anyone from being able to import your RSS feed into another system when it's locked. But I need to use the RSS feed on Apple Podcasts and things later on. So again, we can always change that. And I do want to include it in the Libsyn directory. So let's save that. Oh, what do I miss there? The artwork, of course. So depending on your host, it might ask you on the next page or on the sign up page. So we're going to add our cover art here that you've created, your square artwork that's going to show in the podcast platforms. So I'm going to find my podcast artwork. It's going to be the large PNG file, the highest quality option. Libsyn also has the option for a widescreen artwork for YouTube and Facebook, but I'm going to leave that blank for now because I'll be uploading to YouTube manually. And now we can click save. So that's all the details saved. Now we can go into episodes and add our trailer and first couple of episodes. I'm going to click new up there, new episode. And now it's a case of finding the file for your, I'm going to do the trailer first. So this is my MP3 for my trailer. Episode type. You should have this option. If you don't, it's just going to have to be listed as your first episode. But in your podcast host, you should have the option to change the episode type as trailer. Obviously, if you're not using a trailer, then it's just going to be a standard episode. I'm not sure if it's going to let me use 0 as an episode number. Probably not, but we're going to try it because episode 1 will be episode 1 and so on. And for my trailer, the episode title is just going to be Podcasting Amplified Trailer. And the description will be the description of the show. So that's basically what the trailer's covering. This information I don't need to fill in because it's going to use the defaults that we set in the previous step. So tags, that's only for YouTube, and I'm not uploading directly to YouTube from Libsyn. I'm doing that manually. Category, author, they're all just going to be set from the default. For the trailer, I'm going to be using the default episode artwork. So that's all good. And now you want to be careful that you don't click publish here if you're not ready to publish. We're actually going to be scheduling this episode. And the launch date for the podcast is 22nd November. The trailer I'm going to be releasing 1 week prior. And for the trailer, I'm just going to make this available first thing in the morning. And there you go. So at this point, whichever host you're using, you should be able to see your podcast trailer or your first episode ready to go. I'm going to add some links to the bottom of this once I've got them available. So links to where it will show up on all the podcast platforms. And then I'm going to do the process again 2 more times for the first 2 episodes. Let's just go over it 1 more time for the first episode and I'll zoom through the second one for you. And the upload is completed now. This Libsyn actually has a nice option, populate form with ID3 tags. So if when you've mastered and exported your episode from Audacity, GarageBand, Adobe Audition, whatever digital audio workstation you used, or if you have a podcast editor, they will hopefully have added ID3 tags embedded into the file with information such as the episode title. So if I click that now, it should give us the episode title. So now to type that in, then I'll manually put in the episode number there. It's full episode, it's a clean episode, not a trailer this time. And I've written show notes as well. So the show notes that you've written for your episode, this is where you'll be pasting them in. I'm just going to copy that. I've saved the show notes in a PDF document. Now you might need to do a little bit of tweaking here just to get the formatting right. Just a word of advice, the spacing is really large when it shows up in Spotify. So when these show notes show up below your episode in Spotify, if you're adding like double spaces here, it may look sort of readable, but in Spotify, it's going to be like half a page of empty space. So I just want to keep this as a single space. And then another thing to point out is that in Apple Podcasts, I'm specifying Apple Podcasts and Spotify because they're the most popular places that people find your podcast. The links don't show as hyperlinks. So this is why I paste in, well, at least they don't on the web version. This is why I paste in the full link so people can copy and paste it if they want to find out more. So I've tidied up my show notes now. The only thing that I can't add in there is the links to where it's going to show up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and so on. I'll come back and do that later. And then we've got the option to add episode artwork. So if you're doing just a single artwork across your whole show, you don't need to do this. But if you're doing individual episode artwork with, a headshot of the guest or just a heading for the episode, then you can add that there. And that's what I've done for this one. And then just going to schedule this one again. So this is the launch episode, and this is going to be on the 22nd. And just choose a time. I'm going to be launching episodes first thing in the morning, UK time. So I've got my trailer scheduled and the first 2 episodes. If we go back over to our podcast launch plan, I'm just going to tick off sign up to a podcast host, which you've done, complete the host setup, and scheduled first trailer and episode. So the next thing to do is to enable distribution so that on the launch day or whenever your trailer launches, this podcast goes out to all the platforms. It might be worded a little bit differently in your host, and you'll have to have a look for it. There'll be help guides and things on any podcast host if you can't find it. But in Libsyn, if we click on there, we've got destinations in the settings. It might show as distribution or similar on yours. So as you can see, it's got a list of all these places that your podcast could show on. So Spotify up there, Apple Podcasts, Samsung, all these different ones, Deezer, Amazon Music. And you can see that a couple of them where you said say connected. So with Libsyn and pretty much any podcast host, it's going to automatically give you a website link within their system. So when we've set up our podcast website page, the episodes will show up on there automatically. And then also the Libsyn Classic feed. And then for Apple Podcasts, it does require you to manually set that up on the Apple website, which we're going to do in just a moment. And Spotify, let's click on that because that's a big one, and that's a little bit easier than setting up on Apple Podcasts. So we've got the RSS feed there, and it just needs a few details. RSS feed overrides, you don't need to worry about this. It's just overriding the title and things for Spotify, but it's going to be the same on all of them. And then we're just approving Spotify's terms. Really simple process for Spotify. And obviously if you're using Spotify for podcasters, then it will just be automatic anyway. And you can see that it now says connected. So now that we've got a trailer and we've got our RSS feed set up, which the host will have given you automatically, on launch day, our podcast episode and trailer, it should all show up on Spotify, but it can take a couple of weeks for your RSS feed to be picked up by all these places. So if it's not showing on the first day and you only sort of gave it a couple of days, then don't panic. Again, it can take a little bit longer for everything to show up. But the fact that it's connected now is a good thing. Now let's get set up with Apple Podcasts. So I'm going to click edit, and it's going to give us our RSS feed. Now you'll be using this RSS feed a lot, so you can save it elsewhere if you like. And we're just going to click copy. Now some podcast hosts, you have to do it manually. Libsyn, you can do it automatically through Libsyn, but I'd rather do it through my Apple ID so I can get access through that. So I'm going to submit the show manually, and it's just going to give you a link to Apple Podcast Connect because you've got to do it separately on the Apple website. If you have an Apple ID already that you want to use, you can just log in as you would in iTunes or similar. If you don't, or you want to create a new one specific for your podcast, you can click create yours now. And that's what I'm going to do for this. So I've entered all my details in there, and we're going to continue to create the ID. And then once you've got your Apple ID, you can sign into Apple Podcasts Connect. You will need to have signed in to one of Apple's services before. I'll leave a link in the description to the instructions on how to do that, because it is a bit of a palaver. They don't make it easy, but it is worth it because obviously Apple Podcasts is one of the biggest podcast platforms around. It's then going to ask you to add a couple more details to set up your account, and then you're in finally. And then we can add the show using that RSS feed link. So click add show with an RSS feed, and then you go back into your podcast host, copy your RSS feed and paste it in, and there we have it. So it shows up with the name, which is great, and it shows as draft because I've only just submitted it, so it's going to take a little while for things to populate, but it's got a couple of weeks anyway until the trailer needs to release. I'm going to fill in any details there that it hasn't picked up from Libsyn, like the content rights details, contact information. You can put that there if you'd like. And then checking through these different settings as well, making sure that the show is going to be available for all countries and regions, making sure that it's available for distribution, because a lot of other podcast players actually use Apple Podcast distribution to show on their platforms. So you want to make sure that that's checked, and then release the show as soon as it's published. So as soon as our first episode goes out, it should pick up your feed. And then this is where you can find your ratings and reviews once you've collected some. Then there's nothing in episodes. We don't need to add an episode there because it will be pushed through from your podcast host. And now we're back in our podcast host, so we can just cancel that because we're just waiting for that to do its thing. And it comes up as connected as well because it's something you need to do yourself. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but whichever ones you want your podcast to show up on, which is going to be most of them probably, so Apple Music, Deezer and things, you should get an option, then it should give you some instructions. You get a few extra instructions on some of the hosts than others. Like, for example, Amazon Music, nice and simple. It's going to give you a special feed for your podcast, and you can change the link. It's mainly just so you're agreeing to the terms of service, and then your podcast host will do the rest of the work. And then back on our podcast launch planner, we can enable distribution. We can check that we've enabled that and that we've enabled Apple Podcasts. One other thing you might want to look at is if your podcast host, like most, includes a website, you can edit your website as well. Even if you've got your own dedicated website on your domain, I think it's nice to set this up just so you've got somewhere where you can guarantee your episodes are going to show up on day one. So produce a message. This is just going to be a message that comes up at the top of the screen. For now, I'm just going to use the one sentence tagline for the show. You can always change this later on. Then we're going to add our colors for the show, look right for the brand, and I'm going to see if the font's available that I use. If not, I'll just use a general one for now. Again, you can always change this as you go. Depending on your host, there might be paid options to add your own domain, so you can do that if you like. And we can always add some more details later on to this. I just want to get this set up to show you for now. And on Libsyn, it lets you add an icon for the top of the screen as well for the website. Then click save. And now if we go to the link that it gives you, it should come up with the details that we've entered. And there we go. So this is going to show all of your podcast episodes that come out as soon as they're published. And you can share the link to this with people. And then it's got a link to listening on Spotify anyway. And once things are set up, it should come up with Apple Podcasts and things as well. So if you don't have your own website, it is quite nice to have this as a hub and just as a link to send people. Then they can click through and subscribe where they want to. Congratulations on reaching the end of this series. I really can't wait to see your podcast out into the world. I hope this is going to help your podcast launch with a bang. If you downloaded the podcast launch planner, link below, it also goes over some things that you can do over the next 4 weeks after you've launched to help keep up that momentum. And if you need any direct support with your launch, you can always contact me on my website, linked below as well. Let me know in the comments section below once you've launched your podcast. Feel free to link it. I'd love to see your podcast out in the world. And if you haven't subscribed already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more podcasting content. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.